The needle trembled in Ella's weathered hands as she stitched the final seam of the burial shroud. Not for the dead, but for the living. 3 children of Master Thornfield lay bound in silk and lace, their small bodies still warm, still breathing, still trusting the gentle hands that had mended their clothes for 7 years. It was September 12, 1837, on Willowbrook Plantation in Kentucky. What began as another day of endless needlework ended as the most calculated revenge in the annals of American slavery. This is the vengeance of Ella Mae Washington, the seamstress who turned thread into noose, who made fabric into judgment, who stitched justice with her own bleeding fingers. This is the true story of an enslaved black woman who used her craft to deliver the final verdict. A moment that turned Kentucky soil red in a time when black lives were measured by the yard. Before we continue with the video, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time is it right now on your clock. And don't forget to hit the like button. The morning mist clung to Willowbrook Plantation like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating. In the quarters where Ella Mae Washington had lived for 7 years, dawn came not with birdsong but with the crack of the overseer's whip against his boot. A sound that meant another day of bending, bleeding, surviving. Ella's cabin sat apart from the others, closer to the big house because Master Thornfield valued her needle more than her soul. Her fingers, long and graceful despite the calluses, moved like spiders across fabric, weaving dreams she could never live. She was known throughout Kentucky as the finest seamstress this side of Louisville. Her stitches were perfect, her patterns intricate, her ability to mend what was torn almost magical. But Ella Mae Washington was property, bought for $800 at a Richmond auction when she was 15, sold away from her mother's arms while her father's blood still stained the auction block floor. Master Charles Thornfield was not the worst of his kind, but cruelty came to him like breathing. He was a man of moderate wealth, 300 acres of tobacco and cotton, 47 slaves, and a family that lived as though their comfort was ordained by God himself. His wife Margaret was pale and sharp-tongued, given to fainting spells when the heat pressed too close or when the reality of slavery threatened her delicate sensibilities. Their children, Thomas, barely 10, little Catherine, 8, and baby James, not yet 5, were raised to see black faces as fixtures, no more human than the furniture Ella polished or the floors she scrubbed. Ella worked in the sewing room, a small chamber off the main house where sunlight filtered through lace curtains and landed on bolts of silk, cotton, and wool. Here she spent 14 hours a day, her back bent over fabric, her eyes straining in the dim light, her fingers moving in endless rhythm. Stitch by stitch, she created the garments that clothed the Thornfield family, the quilts that warmed their beds, the curtains that gave them privacy. Every thread was pulled with hands that belonged to another, every pattern cut by a mind that was owned like livestock. But ownership could not reach the deepest places. In the quiet moments between stitches, when Master Thornfield's voice echoed from the parlor, and Mistress Margaret's laughter tinkled like broken glass, Ella remembered. She remembered her mother's face, round and kind, singing work songs that carried messages in their melodies. She remembered her father's hands, strong and gentle, teaching her to carve wood and mend cloth with equal skill. She remembered the night they came for him, the dogs and the torches and the rope that ended his rebellion with a snap that still echoed in her dreams. The Thornfield children often visited her sewing room, drawn by curiosity and boredom. Thomas, the eldest, would stand behind her chair and watch her work, sometimes asking questions about the patterns, sometimes pulling threads just to see her start over. Catherine, sweet-faced and golden-haired, would play with scraps of fabric while Ella worked, creating little dolls and pretend tea parties. Baby James would toddle around the room, his chubby hands reaching for anything that gleamed or rustled. To the world it might have seemed gentle, children and their devoted seamstress. But Ella knew better. She was not their governess or their friend. She was their property, no different from their horses or their hunting dogs. When Thomas grew tired of her work, he would strike her hands with a switch, just as his father had taught him. When Catherine wanted attention, she would pull Ella's hair or pinch her arms, learning cruelty as naturally as she learned to read. Baby James, too young for malice but already shaped by it, would bite and scratch when he wanted something Ella could not give. The nights were Ella's only refuge, but even then, she was not free. Master Thornfield had other uses for her after the sun went down. Visits to her cabin that left her body aching and her spirit fractured. Margaret Thornfield knew, of course. All plantation mistresses knew. But she turned her face away, as white women did, and took her revenge on Ella in smaller, sharper ways. Cold food, torn dresses to mend, impossible deadlines that meant working through the night until her fingers bled onto the fabric. It was on such a night, in the sweltering heat of August, that Ella's world cracked open like a seed in drought. She was mending a tear in Master Thornfield's coat, the same coat he had worn when he visited her cabin 3 nights before, when she heard the sound. A scream, high and desperate, coming from the quarters. She dropped her needle and ran, her bare feet slapping against the dirt path, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scream belonged to Mercy, a girl barely 16 who worked in the kitchen. 2 overseers held her down while a third raised his whip, her dress torn away, her back already striped with welts. Master Thornfield stood watching, his arms crossed, his face calm as stone. "Please," Mercy sobbed, her voice breaking. "Please, I didn't take nothing. I swear on my mama's grave, I didn't take nothing." But the whip fell anyway, again and again, until the girl's cries became whimpers, until her blood soaked into the earth, until she lay still as death itself. Ella watched from the shadows, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. She watched Master Thornfield's face, saw the pleasure there, the satisfaction of power exercised without consequence. She watched his children peek from behind their mother's skirts, learning their first lessons in dominion over human flesh. That night, as Ella sat in her cabin, her needle moving through fabric by candlelight, something shifted inside her chest. The threads she pulled seemed to whisper secrets. The patterns she traced looked like maps to freedom. The fabric itself felt alive beneath her fingers. She thought of Mercy's blood in the dirt. She thought of her father's broken neck. She thought of her mother's tears, shed in silence so no white face would see them fall. She thought of every child sold away, every woman violated, every man worked to death in these endless fields. The needle in her hand felt different now. Not just a tool, but a weapon. Not just thread, but rope. Not just fabric, but shrouds waiting to be filled. By morning, Ella Mae Washington had made her choice. The seamstress would become the executioner. The children who pulled her hair and struck her hands would learn that even the gentlest fingers could tie the tightest knots. The master who used her body would discover that the slave who sewed his clothes could just as easily sew his children's death. She would not run. She would not hide. She would not beg for mercy from those who had never shown it. She would use the only power they had left her, the skill in her fingers and the thread in her hands, to deliver justice 1 stitch at a time. The sewing room felt different that morning. The light seemed sharper, the shadows deeper, the very air thick with possibility and dread. Ella Mae Washington sat at her usual place, her back straight, her hands steady, her eyes clear as mountain water. Around her, bolts of fabric stood like silent witnesses, spools of thread gleamed like small weapons, and needles waited like tiny swords. Today she would not mend what was torn. Today she would tear what had never been broken. Today the seamstress would finally sew justice. The autumn of 1837 painted Willowbrook Plantation in shades of amber and blood. The tobacco leaves hung heavy in the curing barns, their sweet smoke mixing with the sharper smell of fear that seemed to seep from the very soil. Ella Mae Washington moved through her daily routine with the precision of a clockwork figure, her needle dancing through fabric, her fingers never faltering, her eyes giving away nothing of the storm gathering in her chest. It had been 3 weeks since Mercy's beating, 3 weeks since the girl had died from infection, her wounds festering in the August heat while Master Thornfield forbade anyone to tend her properly. 3 weeks since Ella had watched a 16-year-old girl breathe her last in the dirt while the master's children giggled from their bedroom windows above. 3 weeks of planning, of measuring, of preparing for a justice that no court would ever deliver. The Thornfield children continued their visits to the sewing room, drawn by habit and the strange comfort they found in Ella's steady presence. Thomas, now 10 and already showing his father's casual cruelty, would tear holes in perfectly good cloth just to watch Ella mend them. "Fix it, Ella," he would command, his voice a miniature echo of his father's authority. "And make it better than it was before." Catherine, 8 years old with golden ringlets and her mother's sharp tongue, delighted in making impossible demands. She wanted dresses for her dolls that matched her own, with tiny buttons and perfect pleats that would take hours to complete. "If you can't do it right," she would say, repeating words she had heard from her mother, "then you're not worth the food you eat." Baby James, not yet 5, was the most innocent of the 3. But innocence in a slave owner's child was a temporary thing. He would climb onto Ella's lap while she worked, his chubby hands reaching for the bright threads, his presence a constant reminder of how quickly sweetness could sour into something twisted. Ella would hold him gently, her hands steady despite the hatred burning in her veins, because she understood something the Thornfield family never could. Evil was not born. It was taught, thread by thread, lesson by lesson, until it became as natural as breathing. The plan came to Ella in pieces, like a quilt pattern emerging from scattered scraps. She began to collect what she needed, hiding items where no one would think to look. Extra thread, strong and silk smooth, the kind used for the finest embroidery work. Needles of different sizes, some thin as whispers, others thick enough to pierce leather. Fabric in colors that would not show stains. And always, always, she watched and listened, learning the rhythms of the house, the moments when she would be alone with the children, the times when their parents' attention turned elsewhere. Master Thornfield had grown bolder in his nighttime visits to Ella's cabin, emboldened by his wife's willful blindness and the knowledge that no slave could refuse him. On these nights Ella lay still as stone, her body present but her mind elsewhere, planning and preparing for the day when accounts would be settled. She endured because she had to, because resistance would mean death or worse, because she needed to survive long enough to complete what she had started. Margaret Thornfield, for her part, took her revenge in smaller, sharper ways. She would inspect Ella's work with a magnifying glass, searching for flaws that existed only in her imagination. She would change her mind about colors and patterns after hours of work had been completed, forcing Ella to start over. She would withhold food or water, claiming that slaves worked better when they were hungry. All of this Ella accepted with the same stone-faced endurance she had learned from her mother, the same silent strength that had carried her people through centuries of bondage. But endurance had limits, and Ella Mae Washington had reached hers. The opportunity came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the air hung heavy with the promise of rain and the house seemed to doze in the pre-storm stillness. Master Thornfield had ridden to town on business, taking the overseer and several of the field hands with him. Margaret Thornfield lay in her bedroom with one of her headaches, the curtains drawn, a damp cloth pressed to her forehead. The house slaves moved quietly through their duties, and the children, bored and restless, gravitated toward the sewing room, as they always did when routine was disrupted. Ella sat at her work table, her hands moving steadily through the repair of a torn shirt, her face calm as a lake before a storm. The children settled around her like birds on a branch, Thomas picking at a loose thread on the arm of a chair, Catherine playing with a rag doll, baby James building towers with empty spools. The room was peaceful, almost cozy, filled with the soft sounds of children at play and the whisper of thread through fabric. "Tell us a story." "Ella," Catherine demanded, her voice carrying the imperious tone she had inherited from her mother. "Tell us about the time before we owned you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, casual cruelty delivered with a child's thoughtlessness. But Ella heard the deeper truth beneath them, the assumption of ownership so complete it seemed natural as breathing. Ella's hands never paused in their work, her voice steady and low as she began to speak. "Once upon a time," she said, her needle catching the light as it moved through fabric, "there was a woman who could sew magic into cloth. She could make threads strong as iron chains, patterns that would hold tighter than any rope, stitches that would never come undone no matter how hard someone pulled against them." Thomas leaned closer, his eyes bright with interest despite himself. "What kind of magic?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper, as though they were sharing secrets. Ella smiled, the expression warm and gentle and terrible all at once. "The kind that teaches lessons," she said softly. "The kind that makes sure children remember what they've learned." Her hands moved faster now, the needle flashing like silver lightning, thread pulling tight with each stitch. "Would you like to see some magic, children? Would you like to learn how strong thread can be?" The children nodded eagerly, drawn in by the promise of something special, something just for them. Catherine clapped her hands together. Thomas scooted his chair closer, and baby James looked up from his spools with wide, trusting eyes. They had no idea they were about to become the stars of their own story, the subjects of a lesson that would be whispered in slave quarters for generations to come. Ella reached into her sewing basket and pulled out 3 lengths of silk thread, each 1 yards long, each one strong enough to bear weight far greater than a child's body. The thread gleamed in the afternoon light filtering through the windows, beautiful as spun gold, soft as a mother's touch. She had been preparing this thread for weeks, treating it with special care, making it perfect for the work ahead. "Come closer," Ella said, her voice gentle as a lullaby. "Let me show you how the magic works." The storm was coming. The air pressed heavy against the windows, and somewhere in the distance thunder rolled like the drums of an approaching army. But inside the sewing room all was calm and quiet and ready. The seamstress was about to begin her final, most important work. The children who had learned cruelty from their parents' lips were about to receive their last lesson. And the thread that had mended so many tears was finally going to create some of its own. The silk thread whispered through Ella's fingers like secrets passed from mother to daughter, each strand strong enough to bear the weight of justice too long delayed. The 3 Thornfield children gathered around her chair, their faces bright with curiosity and the terrible innocence of those who had never known consequence for their cruelty. Outside, the storm pressed closer, thunder rolling across the Kentucky hills like the hoofbeats of approaching riders. But inside the sewing room, time seemed suspended, caught between one heartbeat and the next. "Now then," Ella said, her voice soft as cotton, warm as summer rain. "Who wants to learn the first lesson?" Her hands moved with practiced ease, forming loops in the silk thread, creating patterns that looked like flowers or butterflies or nooses, depending on how the light caught them. The children leaned closer, drawn by the promise of magic, by the novelty of having Ella's full attention without the pressure of work to be done. Thomas, always eager to assert his authority as the eldest, stepped forward first. "I want to learn," he declared, his chest puffed out with the importance of his 10 years. I'm old enough to know grown-up things. His small hands, already marked with calluses from the riding crop his father had given him, reached toward the gleaming thread. Ella smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a devoted servant sharing a quiet moment with the children in her care. "Of course you are, Master Thomas," she said, using his title like a caress, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "You're old enough to understand that every action has consequences, aren't you? Every choice we make leads to another choice, and another, until we find ourselves somewhere we never expected to be." She began to wrap the thread around Thomas's wrists, her movements slow and gentle, like a mother braiding her daughter's hair. "This is how we measure strength," she explained, her voice never wavering from its soothing tone. Thread by thread, layer by layer, until what seemed fragile becomes unbreakable. Thomas stood still, fascinated by the intricate patterns Ella was creating, the way the silk caught the light and threw it back in rainbow fragments. Catherine, not to be outdone by her brother, tugged at Ella's skirt. "I want to learn too," she insisted, her golden ringlets bouncing with each word. "I want to know the magic words. I want to make pretty patterns like you do." Her doll dangled forgotten from one hand, its painted face staring blindly at the ceiling, its cloth body limp with neglect, patience. "Miss Catherine," Ella murmured, never pausing in her work with Thomas. "Good things come to those who wait. Your turn will come very soon, and when it does, you'll learn something you'll never forget." She pulled the thread tighter around Thomas's wrists, the silk biting into his skin just enough to make him shift uncomfortably. "Are you learning, Master Thomas? Can you feel how the thread holds you?" Thomas tried to pull his hands free and frowned when he found he couldn't. The thread had seemed so delicate when Ella was handling it, but now it felt strong as iron bands around his wrists. "Ella," he said, his voice taking on the imperious tone he had learned from his father, "untie me now. I don't want to play this game anymore." But Ella was already moving toward Catherine, more thread flowing through her fingers like water, like silk, like the rope that had broken her father's neck. "Games have rules, Master Thomas," she said conversationally, beginning to wind the thread around Catherine's small ankles. "And the most important rule is that once you start playing, you have to finish. You can't just stop when you get tired or bored or frightened. That wouldn't be fair, would it?" Catherine giggled as the thread tickled her legs, but her laughter had a nervous edge now. "It tickles, Ella," she said, trying to step away and finding that the thread held her fast. "Why can't I move?" "What are you doing?" Her voice rose slightly, the first note of fear creeping in as she realized that something was different about this game, something that made her stomach twist with an emotion she had never had to feel before. Baby James, sensing the change in his siblings' moods, began to cry, his chubby face screwing up with confusion and distress. He toddled toward Ella, his arms outstretched, seeking the comfort she had always provided when the world became too frightening to understand. "Ella," he sobbed, the word muffled by tears and the thumb he had stuck in his mouth. "Ella, up. Want up." Ella's heart clenched for a moment, looking down at the baby who had done nothing worse than be born into evil, who had never chosen the cruelty that was already being shaped into his bones. But mercy was a luxury she could not afford, not when justice had been denied for so long, not when the scales had to be balanced with the only weights she had. She lifted James gently, settling him on her hip as she had done 1,000 times before, and began to wrap the third length of thread around his tiny wrists. "Hush now, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly as she worked. "It'll all be over soon. The lesson's almost finished." James's cries subsided into hiccups as her familiar hands soothed him, even as they bound him. He didn't understand what was happening. Couldn't comprehend why the woman who had mended his clothes and sung him lullabies was now tying him up with pretty silk thread that sparkled in the lamplight. Thomas was struggling now, his face red with effort and indignation. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice cracking with the onset of panic. "I'm telling my father." "He'll whip you bloody for this." "He'll sell you to the rice fields where you'll die in the mud." The threats tumbled from his lips with the ease of long practice, words he had heard his father use, words that had always brought immediate obedience from every black face on the plantation. But Ella just smiled, that same gentle, patient smile she had worn for 7 years while his family had used her body and her labor and her silence for their own comfort. "Your father isn't here, Master Thomas," she said calmly, testing the strength of the bond she had created. "And by the time he returns, our lesson will be complete. You'll have learned something very important about consequences, about what happens when you hurt people who have no power to hurt you back. Except sometimes they find a way." Catherine was crying now, great gulping sobs that shook her small frame. "I want my mama," she wailed, tugging frantically at the thread around her ankles. "I want my mama. Mama! Mama!" But Margaret Thornfield lay drugged with laudanum in her darkened room, lost in dreams that were probably more pleasant than her waking hours, and her cries went unheard and unanswered. "Your mama can't help you now, Miss Catherine," Ella said softly, lifting baby James higher on her hip, feeling his weight, calculating the physics of what was to come, just like my mama couldn't help me when they dragged me away from her at the auction block. Just like Mercy's mama couldn't help her when your father had her whipped to death for a crime she didn't commit. Sometimes mamas can't protect their babies, no matter how much they love them, no matter how much they want to. She moved toward the heavy wooden beam that ran across the ceiling of the sewing room, a beam strong enough to support the weight of the entire floor above, certainly strong enough for what she had planned. The storm outside had arrived in earnest now, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling through the eaves like the voices of all the ancestors calling for justice. Lightning illuminated the room in stark, white flashes, throwing wild shadows across the walls, making the children's faces look like masks in a fever dream. "Please," Thomas whispered, his bravado finally cracking, revealing the frightened child beneath. "Please don't hurt us. We're sorry. We'll be good. We promise we'll be good." His voice broke on the last words, and for a moment Ella saw not the little tyrant who had tormented her for years, but just a scared boy who was finally learning what it felt like to be powerless. But promises made in fear were worth nothing, and Ella had heard too many of them to be moved by one more. "I'm sure you are sorry," she said, her voice still gentle, still kind, even as she threw the end of Thomas's thread over the beam and began to pull. "I'm sure you would promise anything to make this stop. But being sorry doesn't bring back the dead, Master Thomas. Being sorry doesn't heal the scars or mend the broken bones or give children back to their mothers. Being sorry is just words, and words are cheap." The thread tightened, and Thomas found himself pulled upward, his feet leaving the ground, his bound hands taking his weight. He gasped, his face purpling as the silk bit into his wrists, cutting off circulation, making his fingers tingle and go numb. "This is what it feels like," Ella explained conversationally, as though she were teaching him a new stitch or showing him how to match colors. "This is what it feels like to have no choice, to be helpless, to know that someone else controls whether you live or die. This is what every slave knows, every day of their lives." Catherine's screams rose to a pitch that should have brought the entire household running. But the storm swallowed them, and the house slaves had learned long ago not to investigate sounds that came from the master's family. Her thread joined Thomas's over the beam, and soon she too was hanging, her small body twisting as she fought against the bonds that held her. The golden ringlets her mother had been so proud of were dark with sweat and tears now, plastered to her skull like seaweed on a drowned corpse. Baby James, still in Ella's arms, looked around with the confused expression of a child who knew something was terribly wrong but couldn't understand what. When Ella gently placed him on the floor and began to tie his thread to the beam, he reached for her with chubby hands, babbling the wordless sounds that passed for speech at his age. He trusted her still, even as she lifted him, even as the thread took his weight, even as his breath began to whistle through his constricted throat. The 3 Thornfield children hung from the beam like grotesque ornaments, their bodies casting twisted shadows on the walls in the flickering lightning. They struggled at first, their small faces purple with effort and terror, their mouths opening and closing like fish pulled from water. But silk thread was strong, and Ella's knots were perfect, and slowly, inexorably, their movements stilled. Ella stood watching them, her hands clasped in front of her, her face calm as stone. She felt no joy in their deaths, no satisfaction in their suffering. This was not revenge, though it might look like it to those who came after. This was justice, pure and simple, the kind of justice that balanced scales and paid debts in full. For every lash that had fallen on black skin, for every child sold away from their parents, for every woman violated in the darkness, for every man worked to death in the fields. Here was the accounting. When it was done, when the 3 small bodies hung still and silent from the beam, Ella began to arrange the scene. She scattered fabric scraps around the room, overturned chairs, created the appearance of struggle and accident. 3 children playing with thread, getting tangled, unable to free themselves before it was too late. Tragic, certainly, but believable. Who would suspect the gentle seamstress, the devoted servant who had cared for these children since they were babies? She saved 1 piece of silk thread, the finest piece, and with her needle she embroidered a message into a scrap of white cloth. The stitches were perfect, each letter formed with the same skill she had used to create beauty for 7 years. "By their fruits ye shall know them," the message read, a quote from Matthew that seemed fitting for the occasion. She pinned it to Thomas's shirt where it would be found by whoever discovered the bodies. Then Ella Mae Washington, seamstress and executioner, walked calmly from the room. She returned to her cabin, washed her hands and face, and sat down to wait. The storm raged outside, and inside her chest, something that had been burning for 7 years, finally began to cool. The lesson was taught, the debt was paid, the scales were balanced at last. When Master Thornfield returned from town 3 hours later, his boots muddy from the rain, his coat dripping water on the polished floors, he found his house in chaos. Margaret had awakened from her laudanum dreams to discover her children missing and had set the servants to searching every room. It was the cook who found them, hanging from the sewing-room beam like fruit from a bitter tree, their faces peaceful in death, their small bodies still as dolls. The screams that rose from the big house that night could be heard clear to the quarters, cutting through the storm like a knife through silk. Margaret Thornfield collapsed when she saw her children, her body convulsing with grief and shock and the terrible understanding that her world had shattered beyond repair. Master Thornfield stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the message pinned to his son's chest, reading the words over and over as though repetition might change their meaning. The authorities came, of course. The sheriff, the coroner, men in black coats who asked questions and took notes and made pronouncements about tragic accidents and the dangers of leaving children unsupervised. The silk thread was so fine, they said, so deceptive in its strength. Children didn't understand such things. They played until play became peril, and by then it was too late. No one suspected Ella. No one even questioned her very closely. She was just a slave after all, a piece of property no more capable of planning such a thing than a horse or a cow. She answered their few questions with downcast eyes and trembling lips, playing the role of the grieving servant who had failed to protect her charges. She even shed a few tears, and they seemed genuine enough to satisfy the white men who needed their world to make sense, who needed to believe that slaves were incapable of such calculated revenge. But in the quarters, where news traveled faster than wind and secrets were kept better than gold, they knew. They knew that Ella Mae Washington had done something unprecedented, something that would be whispered about for generations. She had turned the master's own children into a lesson about justice, had used her needle and thread to weave a story that would never be forgotten. The plantation changed after that night. Master Thornfield, broken by grief and haunted by the message his son had worn to his grave, never quite recovered his former cruelty. He sold Willowbrook within the year, moving his shattered wife to Louisville, where they could try to forget what had happened in the sewing room. The slaves were sold to different plantations, scattered like seeds on the wind, but they carried Ella's story with them wherever they went. Ella herself was bought by a plantation in Tennessee, her skill with needle and thread making her valuable even as her reputation made her dangerous. But she never spoke of what had happened at Willowbrook, never confirmed or denied the whispered stories that followed her like shadows. She lived quietly, working her magic with fabric and thread, teaching other slave women the patterns that could bind more than cloth, the stitches that could hold secrets as well as seams. She died in 1854, 17 years after that storm-lashed night in Kentucky, her fingers still nimble with age, her eyes still sharp as the needles she wielded. They buried her in the slave cemetery behind the plantation house, marking her grave with a simple wooden cross that bore only her name. But her real monument was the story that lived on in the quarters, in the hushed voices of mothers teaching daughters, in the careful hands of seamstresses who understood that thread could be more than thread, that stitches could hold more than fabric together. They say that even now, when the wind is right and the storm clouds gather over Kentucky, you can still hear the sound of thread being pulled tight, of needles flashing in lamplight, of a woman's voice humming work songs while she sews justice into silk. They say that flowers bloom wild around Willowbrook's ruins, and that sometimes, just sometimes, you can find scraps of silk thread tangled in their stems, still strong after all these years, still holding fast to secrets that will never come undone. The seamstress had finished her work. The lesson was taught, and somewhere in the darkness between lightning flashes, Ella Mae Washington smiled the smile of a woman who had finally, after 7 years of silence, found her voice and used it to speak the only truth that mattered. By their fruits ye shall know them. And now, at last, they would. If this story cut through you like thread through silk, leave your mark below. Subscribe to keep these forgotten voices alive, and share this tale with those who understand that sometimes justice comes not from courts or laws, but from hands that refuse to stay silent any longer.